I hope it's Spanish.
Cheers. Happy 100th episode,
Happy
everybody.
100th episode.
Nice of you to join us.
We've made it through. It's been a few years now.
Yeah, it's been. Our release cadence is not the fastest.
No, thank you very much for sticking with us.
Yeah.
I think ultimately, I'd have to say, if we were really pushing ourselves to try and do it any other way, we might not have survived.
Yeah, 2023 is going to be a good year. I was going to read a little quotation. I went to look at the cathedral, a modern cathedral and one of the most hideous buildings in the world. It has 4 crenellated spires, exactly the shape of hock bottles. Unlike most of the churches in Barcelona, it was not damaged during the revolution. It was spared because of its artistic value, people said. I think the anarchists showed bad taste in not blowing it up when they had the chance. ... That was George Orwell. Men may be divided into 2 types, men of words and men of action. The first speak, the latter act. I am of the second group. I lack the means to express myself adequately. I would not be able to explain to anyone my artistic concepts. I have not yet concretized them. I have never had time to reflect on them. My hours have been spent in my work. Whether or not you should take that quotation at face value, I don't know exactly. But that was Antoni Gaudí in 1913, talking about himself and his practice. And that's who we're talking about.
On this, the 100th episode of About Buildings and Cities. I'm George Gidgel.
I'm Luke Jones.
We're starting a big series.
Yeah.
On a mega unfashionable architect. I think we've done that a couple of times.
To me, this feels like the most uncool, apart from maybe Ayn Rand. Like, definitely the most...
No, Ayn Rand is very cool.
Maybe she is cool. I guess she has...
No. The reactionaries are extremely uncool.
Yeah. Gaudi is, yeah, I would say the most uncool person we've done on the podcast. And he has a funny position in architectural culture. At one level, he is clearly, alongside maybe Frank Lloyd Wright, the most famous architect in the world, the most universally sort of recognised architect for normal people. I feel like if you were to do a kind of impossible survey of every architectural tea towel in the world, the plurality of them would have a Gaudi building on them. But at the same time, he is a sort of a bit of an oddity who at various points has been kind of pretty unacceptable to architectural historians who sort of, when they're trying to make sense of the development of architecture, where it's come from, where it's going to, he seems extremely perverse. There's a Nicholas Pevsner book called The Anti-Rationalists, in which he's kind of placed alongside people like Factor Cheval, this kind of crazed and slightly brain-damaged French postman who built like an enormous palace in his garden out
We've
of
spoken about him. I can't remember
concrete.
what episode.
Like a true like Illuminé sort of.
I can see why, but it's also completely the wrong.
Yeah, he's not an outsider architect, but he's kind of at certain times been understood as a sort of outsider architect. Within architecture, as architects talk about it, Gaudi is uncool because he's sort of weird, conservative. He deals in a kind of like super lush spatial fantasy, which is like willful, bizarre, but also like painfully serious in a weird and incongruous way. Everything is kind of wrapped up in this mythos of him as a kind of architectural monk, super pious, kind of super dedicated to his work, and like wrapped up in a version of the sort of myth of genius that is like so extreme that is beyond even a cliche. And obviously there are lots of things about him which also people know are really, really exciting. Like he's structurally and materially incredibly kind of interesting. I think we'll probably disagree about this, but I think he has a very distinctive vision of design process, which I would kind of characterize slightly provocatively as being against drawing, or a kind of a architecture of things which are kind of undrawable or which can't be kind of reduced to, in the typically kind of reductive way, to normal kind of architectural projection. I don't know, do you think I've missed anything out in that little...
Well, I have perhaps... I could just say about how I was initially approaching this topic. First I thought, it'd be cool to do that. Gaudi's good. some years ago. I think rather further back in time than when you went to see them, because I saw some of your pictures and they had masks in them. Mine was definitely pre-masks. Two things came up in my mind. The first one of which is, this is very unusual. These are some of the most far out there things to do of anyone we've discussed. There are various design decisions and expressions in his work that, and in quite a number of directions, that are unusual.
Yeah.
And superficially almost inexplicable. Where does this come from?
Yeah.
Which I think is it's not only the chauvinism of modernism or the chauvinism of progress, which means that he's kind of bypassed in the examination of architectural history. It's also that it is difficult to kind of put this into a context. He also seems to me to be an incredible person of his time. He sits between the eras of the sort of proto-Art Nouveau at one end, a period of extremely lavish expression, fantastic exoticism, and at the other end, he exists in the era of expressionism.
Yeah.
An era also of uncanny, or massing that is like deeply interesting, strange, rough. Think of those German buildings, the brick expressionism or Pulzig or something, these very strange shapes. And it feels like, you can put Gaudi alongside that. And at the beginning, I suppose I should have said that the Beaux-Arts and the kind of 2/3 of the way through the 19th century, things were getting very florid.
Yeah.
So you can make sense of that. But then you look again and you think, this is going a lot further.
It all does.
It's quite strange.
Yeah.
And with the particular things, we'll be going through a lot of buildings, so this will seem very vague. But I'm sure we'll be discussing strange shapes and patterns and ornaments, massings, and they lend themselves to comparison with the things that he had around him. I think if there's one thing he would seek to be, it is kind of direct or honest or something like that.
Yeah.
Some word like that, which relates to like taking stuff from the world around him and putting it into a building. So you can see, this is like a natural form, animal, mineral, or vegetable.
Yeah.
Or this is somehow connected to the kind of deep cultural history of his place. But they're also very strange syntheses. Syntheses?
Yeah, they are.
They're like, it's atypical. He is an extreme example of a process, a creative process that we've seen again and again, which is taking known elements and recombining them. But the way he recombines them is very peculiar. And at times, I think, is so lifeful and ingenious. And at other times, I struggle to find them anything other than kind of like... horrible, yeah. And I think that's perhaps because my heart is incapable of sufficient love or something, I'm like,
no,
I don't have enough goodness inside me to quite be able to conquer my, when you've got the plate of chicken sashimi in front of you, you're like, this is probably delicious, but there is a mental barrier I have to overcome in order not only to consume it, but to enjoy it wholeheartedly.
Yes, without any
neurosis. Nausea or neurosis.
Yeah.
Normally when we do these series, people really listen to like the first one. And I thought, like always, the first one has got the beginning projects, which are not the best ones. So do skip ahead if you're only going to listen to one. Get some of the good ones in.
They're pretty modular, yeah. All the later buildings are better as well. We should stop introducing in a minute and start going on. But I think there's a couple of other things which kind of occur to me as interesting. One is, we're going to try and contextualize him, both in terms of the broader time and place, and also the kind of architecture that was before, during, and after him. And I think I find both of those quite inaccessible, like surprisingly inaccessible. It's a context I find it quite hard to get my head around. And when I'm reading about, I've been reading a biography of him. I've been trying to read about, trying to get a sort of sense of what his clients are like, and I don't think I fully have a handle on it. So I'm going to do my best with it. But it is, I think part of his strangeness is that quite sort of inaccessible context of Spain and Catalonia in the last 25 years of the 19th century, really.
Actually, really putting yourself in the thought process of the past is extremely difficult.
Yeah.
I find it extremely difficult to put myself in the thinking process of the 1990s, let alone somewhere as different and exotic as Catalonia in the late 19th century.
Part of my motivation for wanting to do this project was the idea that it would be like perverse, because Gaudi is not someone that people who are into architecture think is very cool. And I sort of had the idea that we could do like a bit of a rescue job on him. Part of what's sort of smothering him is his like incredible popularity. He's a kind of like global destination experience thing.
It's a bit like the Mona Lisa or Van Gogh.
It's kind of hard to see them as anything other than this sort of like top level stand-in for, culture.
It's also like something that even in that context feels like it's sort of fading.
Yeah.
Don't you think? Like, I reckon he was peak popularity in the 90s or something like that.
I've got no idea because
it's very difficult to know.
Yeah,
my motivation is much more simple. I think he's a great architect.
Yeah.
In a kind of can't see the wood for the trees way, a very seldom thought about one.
Yeah, it is funny, isn't it? So he was born in, good question, 1852, and he was the fifth child of a couple, and there's a dispute about where he was born. It's either in a town called Riudoms or in the actual city of Reus, where he spent most of his childhood. That's not very interesting, and it doesn't matter. The family were artisans. They were boiler makers, I think. They were like copper workers, and they had been for like 3 generations. His grandfather had been one, and it was a sort of dynastic marriage of the daughter of a guy with a boiler making business and a young up and coming boiler maker who could then take over the business.
And when you say a boiler, it's a copper.
Copper,
What we would call a copper. Every house in the area around here would have historically had one in the back.
Yeah. So, and he was the youngest of 5 kids, but only he and his elder brother lived to adulthood, but the others all died in childhood or infancy. And he himself was quite sick as a child and had various health problems. And it's part of his kind of mythos is this like struggle with illness as a child, that he had like he had all sorts of problems, including like rheumatism, and he couldn't walk at certain times. There were points where he had to be like carried to school, and he kind of in his own sort of personal reminiscence would relate having heard like the priest or the doctor telling his parents that they should be prepared that he was probably going to die and this kind of thing, and kind of convincing himself that by his own force of will he could force himself to not die and to kind of go on living. Like a lot of his later development, I think stubbornness is like a key part of his sort of formation. I think that you can see a lot of that in some of the scrapes he gets into later.
And am I right in thinking that by the time he was 25, all 4 of his siblings and his mother were dead?
Yeah. Yeah, while he was at university, his older... So I think the family were reasonably well off. They like had a apartment in the city centre, but probably not a great one. And they could afford to send the kids to university, but it was a bit of a stretch to do both of them at the same time. He had to delay his entry into university. While he was at university, his brother, who was a medical student and a bit older than him, died, and his mother also died. So I've been reading this biography, which makes quite a lot of his relationship to kind of local monuments and to the landscape where they are. I think he himself would talk about how those things kind of come into the architecture later. The region is it's called the Beisch Camp, and it's basically like a sort of flat. This is like just looking at a kind of random bit of Google Street View, but it is basically kind of flat land with hazelnuts and oranges and that kind of thing. And then it has this sort of peculiarity that you get the streams coming down from the mountains kind of cut these like deep channels. So you have sort of deep like gorges. And there's a kind of mythic presence as well, which is Montserrat, which is these big mountains kind of with this kind of quite incredible form. I don't know, is it sandstone? What is it that creates this like amazing I don't know, is it like this amazing, like incredibly sort of craggy, and it's not only like an amazing mountain to look at, but it's also a kind of holy mountain, and there's a big monastic foundation there.
Sometimes you get a point in a landscape which you cannot avoid finding significant.
Yeah.
And Montserrat's like that. It's so the plain that he grew up in is like down the coast from the plain that Barcelona's on. And in a way, it's a kind of ridge. Montserrat's on a ridge between them. There's kind of a bit more geography. And on the sides of the slopes, it's mostly craggy, very steep, rocky thing with little tufts of vegetation, green in sort of striated patterns. But then on the top, there are these huge rocks which are rounded in tall domes, in very smooth shapes. It doesn't take a great deal of imagination to project onto his work. Now, actually doing that's probably slightly complicated, but you'd be silly if you weren't going to say that the landscape is one of his sources of inspiration.
And it's like a small city, basically, that he's raised in, about 30,000 people.
Well, small, but also outside of Barcelona.
Yeah.
One of the biggest, or if not the biggest place in Catalonia at the time.
Yeah.
And urbanizing rapidly, and an proto-industrial centre.
Should we sort of say some stuff about what Catalonia was like at this point, and the kind of what's happened in Spain between 1800 and his birth in 1852? Spain
obviously had a difficult, the sort of Napoleonic period, and was racked by war. Later on in the sort of late Napoleonic period, in that time it also lost the great bulk of its overseas colonies, with the exception of the Philippines and Cuba. And it had also failed to... It had gone in, in the early 18th century, it had been a developed economy, and it was clearly falling behind its peers. It was no longer a great power. It also had a lot of internal problems. There was the internal problem of the regions. So the state was fundamentally very centralized, but had very strong historic regions that had strong memories of being independent.
Yeah.
And Catalonia to this day is still one of them, and obviously also the Basque country. And also through the 19th century, like in a lot of places in Europe, you start with, I suppose, the Ancien Régime illiberal forces, which want, clerical power, monarchical power, aristocratic power.
Yeah.
Liberals, who tend to be bourgeois, industrial aristocracy who represent the sort of mercantile interests.
Yeah.
And want to kind of sweep away Ancien Regime power. And then from the mid-19th century onwards, radicals, particularly in Spain, anarchists, who were very active in Barcelona at the time that Gaudi was working, attempting to assassinate people. And there were a series, these tensions, the sort of structure of the wars, the civil wars in Spain is that, I think, the brother of the king who was returned after the Napoleonic period thought he was going to inherit, and they changed the law so that women could inherit, so he didn't. There's a series of wars in support of his line, which are called Carlist wars. They tend to happen at roughly the same period that other things are happening in Europe. There's one, I think, around the time that the Orleanists come in France, 1830s.
Yeah.
Which is very destructive. It kind of lines up those various forces. So the wars in support of him are regionalist and clerical, church power, aristocratic power, and sort of devolution. Yeah. And they're very devastating, but they don't also quite come to the cities. And the effect of these conflicts is also to propel the military to the centre of politics. So there's those conflicts going on. At the same time, the country is undergoing rather unsteady but rapid economic growth, particularly industrialisation and urbanisation. The countryside is in the north, damaged by the wars and pretty poor. And the cities are doing catch-up industrial growth.
Yeah.
So cities like Bilbao and, very crucially for our story, Barcelona are at once kind of menaced by armies out in the hinterland, periodically coming and never quite succeeding in taking them. But at the other hand, enormously expanding in population. And there is a great production of wealth. There's a lot of things you can invest in that are productive.
Yeah.
Big factories are being built. Urbanization means you've got to have bricks and tiles. Workers means they've got to have clothes. Textiles, in other parts of the country, iron and steel, coal, steam trains, big ships, harbours. There's also a lot of money coming in still from the colonies, and there's colonial wars going on at the same time, particularly in Cuba, which end ultimately with a sort of humiliating defeat for Spain, and the beginning of a troubled period of United States colonialism.
I know almost nothing about Spanish history, and I think I had a tendency to read back through the sort of fault lines of the Civil War, where regionalism is aligned broadly to liberal and progressive forces, and against clerical and centralized power. Whereas at this time, it's not really like that, as you say. One of the other big landmarks of Gaudi's childhood was this monastery called the Poblet, which is a big Cistercian house which had been sacked in the first Carlist uprising in the 1830s. Him and his friends had a little magazine that they wrote together, and they kind of would do little projects. And one of the things that they did was an imaginary reconstruction of the Poblet. They talked about how they were going to bring it back into use and kind of restore it.
Bits of the letters reminded me of the crystal chain that we discussed ages ago, where it's oh, I hope you haven't given up on our dreams, our project.
Yeah.
Our fantastic foundation and it really is ecstatic,
yeah,
young, enthusiastic people who are fired up by the powers of the rightness of doing architectural deeds.
Yeah, this is by his friend, I think called Eduardo Toda. He says they write this whole poem about a eulogy for the Poblet, but which is
these are teenagers.
They're teenagers. The culture that they're in is simultaneously all about the romance of Catalan history, and also stridently anti-liberal. So they write, infamous assassins, all of this to the cries of liberty and peace, destroying the glories of our culture and violating the tombs of our heroes, sowing terror everywhere and the fear of death. Oh, you coward who profanes art, if this is liberty, then liberty stinks. And it's this kind of I think that there's a sort of there's an alignment which I've sort of had to get my head around, which is these guys who are they're kind of dandyish, they're foppish, they're super into art, they're super into the nation and the myth of the nation. But
this is Romanticism. It's
Byron.
Also,
yeah, it is. But they're also often strongly drawn, especially as they age, towards Catholicism and towards the church, and they're generally anti-liberal. They're kind of they're against. They kind of identify the forces of sort of progress are are kind of forces of kind of alienation and the kind of
I think he was like that as a teenager. I'm not so sure.
Oh no, I think it goes on into the later life. I think
that maybe, but he managed to get along with his patrons were not of that persuasion. They were broadly liberal, of what was called liberal then, which would now be conservative, as in a liberal, economically liberal, anti-clerical Whig.
Yeah, some of them were pretty Whiggish. Okay, what else should we talk about?
I think that the kind of cultural background
of
this, you've spoken about Romanticism. In the city of Barcelona, you've got the fusion of, it's a very ancient capital, but it's also, at least in the Spanish context, at the absolute forefront of modernity, of Catalan modernity, industrialization, and revivalism is also big. So people are going up into the hills and discovering these ancient, rugged, Romanesque churches, which are survivals from a completely ancient era, with their famous paintings, which are largely collected in the National Catalonian Museum.
Yeah,
they had a big World's Fair, and if you go up, there's a big museum on the top of the hill, which has got a great collection of Gothic art and an enormous collection of really wacky Romanesque. Wacky's not really the right word, but like they are alien.
Yeah,
it's from another sensibility, and I think Gaudi couldn't help but see that. There's also a renewed interest in Spain in general in at least the kind of cultural expressions of the Muslim period. Renewal interest in sort of Moorish architecture, and then also an interest in the kind of world architectural styles, having, the 19th century's gone through the first wave of historicism, and now we're also interested in the arts of Asia and the arts of things that are coming back from the colonies and international trade, and this interest in the exotic.
So I think he started at university in 1868, and then he was there for about 10 years. I think the architecture school there, like basically all the main architects seem to have taught at the architecture school. So he had kind of access to them, and he also had access to all of their kind of collections and things. And he would have been, we kind of know that he was like really into Ruskin, and that he was into Viollet-le-Duc.
That's
are the two.
I'm glad you said figures. Really into Ruskin, because looking at the work, I had surmised as much.
Yeah.
Like, that seems to be, the Ruskinian approach seems to be very important.
Yeah.
What does Viollet-le-Duc mean in that context?
The interest in, well, first...
It also makes complete sense.
Yeah, well, the idea that architecture kind of comes out of construction, and that kind of, you can kind of invent new form out of the logic of processes of construction and of materials. Which are kind of ideas.
The really like banal idiot take of it that I would kind of think of as appropriate to this is like, the past is really cool. I love the Gothic, and cast iron's really cool. We could do a completely new sort of Gothic with cast iron that would be kind of techno Gothic.
Yeah,
and techno Gothic is one of the things that you could sort of think about for.
There's quite a lot of that
for an inane take on Gaudi.
Yeah, technocratic. Yeah. He was at university for rather a long time because he didn't pass all of the classes straight away. I think also he had to work. So, and he seems to have...
He doesn't seem to be a university good student.
Yeah.
One of the books has got a load of his school reports in it, and it's like there's a lot of pass, fail, along with the excellence and goods.
Yeah.
Possibly a little strong-willed.
Yeah. There's a famous quotation when he finally was awarded his degree. The dean said, "Gentlemen, we have in our presence either a genius or a madman." He's referring to Gaudi, who they'd finally decided to let have his degree.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you something. It's not like Ruskin. Ruskin got his honorary double 4th class because he was a thoroughly good chap who was clearly clever but didn't do any work.
Yeah.
But looking at Gaudi's drawings, he was an extremely talented draftsman in the style of the Beaux-Arts.
Yeah.
He clearly applied himself with intensity to architectural subjects. He was probably just not doing some of the boring things, and also doing them not how the way they wanted.
Yeah, I think he was very awkward. I think he didn't do what the professors wanted him to do. I mean, we could look at some of his drawings if you want. So most of his stuff was destroyed because his archive was destroyed in 1936, which we'll kind of get to later. But there are a few which were reproduced during his life and which survive. So there's this like weird funeral arch that he did, which feels very like Viollet-le-Duc.
Yeah. It's like very bulky and a bit Gothic. But with a rounded arch.
So sort of quite expressive use of scale. The classic like little person lurking in the background is a very like Viollet.
I mean, also like a really obvious thing. These drawings are rendered by hands to a really high degree in the Beaux-Arts style. That if you don't know what it is, look at it. They're very professional.
We have like this is another one.
Extremely colourful in real life.
Yeah,
we've got a black and white reproduction.
It's a section of an assembly hall. I mean, between these two, the kind of classic Beaux-Arts drawings are the beautiful rendered section.
Yeah.
There's obviously the plan
and the 2/3 perspective.
And the perspective that. Yeah.
And actually, he would go on to produce these drawings right through his career, right to the end, which are perspectives at slightly difficult angles.
Yeah.
Of like complicated 3D objects, but rotated like 20 degrees, which you would definitely not have done if you hadn't had a Beaux-Arts education. Both because they're really difficult and was something they did, but kind of demonstrates a mastery of a certain sort of like drawing construction.
Should we talk about his early career and then we could just talk about Barcelona? I mean, essentially, like, he does eventually get his degree in 1878. And
he's, by the way, working for architects at the same time as studying.
Yeah, he'd worked for basically worked for all of the different members of staff, who were basically all of the principal architects in Barcelona.
Rourke.
Yeah.
He did all the styles.
He did all the styles. He was obviously...
None of them were radical enough for him.
But the guy who he seems to have got on best with was a guy called Joan Martorell, who set him up. He basically went straight into kind of practice on his own when he graduated, and Martorell kind of brought him in on a few things and set him up with a bunch of little projects which kind of get him going. And
Martorell also teaches him, is very interested in, is it called like geometric statics?
Yeah,
but
graphic statics.
Graphic statics, which is not something that's taught now, although quite an interesting idea, which is like using geometric drawing, graph drawing to represent forces.
Yeah. I think we should...
And force lines.
I think we should unpack how that works when we talk about Colonia Güell, because it's the deceptively simple starting point for those crazy projects.
There's a career trajectory with him.
Yeah.
But so much of the stuff, you find it's there. At the beginning, he's got kind of all the elements on the back burner, and he's just going to kind of mulch that stew's just going to kind of simmer down for his whole life.
Oh yeah, he worked on...
I think we should talk about those two little student drawings.
Yeah,
briefly.
so what's this? So this
is a student drawing for a pier end pavilion, I think. It's
looks like Brighton Pavilion. It's kind of Murgle Gothic.
Yeah, and it's like a
cream
wide flat building with two little sort of mock Gothic lighthouses on either end, and sort of Gothic-y swags going out to angled kind of flagpoles. It's very romantic, don't you think?
It is very romantic, yeah.
It also feels like you could that could feature in a comic book background. It's got lovely little boats, and then the next drawing as well. This one excited me for a couple of reasons. It's a big fountain. It's a fantastical confection. It's very cakey, like rows of filigree kind of arcaded circles. There's a great fountain rising up the middle, like fancy, fine, decorated sort of finals on the top, and then all these parabolas of water coming out, being kind of ejected out, which has this sort of chandelier quality. At one level, I thought, this great interest in the fantastical and exotic, and very dreamy is there, but also this real enjoyment of drawing parabolic shapes, and kind of forces set against horizontals, which we'll see more of later.
Yeah, and he did some work on the hydraulics of a fountain that was actually built in the Ciutadella Park.
And maybe some of the sculptures for it.
Yeah,
something like that. Heard something like that.
And then he designed this. He designed this bizarre desk for himself, which I find really peculiar. It looks
like a Gothic iron lung.
The halves. It's like a kind of cloche. The halves in the middle sort of slides outwards. It's a kind of upturned boat-shaped cloche, and then the legs are kind of little and set in with these sort of expressed big hips. Everything is super over-decorated.
This really does feel like that you could have this. This feels like it could be from Warhammer. You kind of like push it through, like robot priests kind of pull apart the two things, and a long dead spectre emerges from the center of this desk. But instead, it's full of bits of paper.
Yeah, but so there are various stories about how Gaudi met his most important client, Count Eusebi Güell. But one of them is that it was at the workshop of the guy who was making this desk for him, who was a kind of regular collaborator. So it's
like he designs that vitrine.
Yeah.
That's the one I've heard.
Yeah.
Which was made at that workshop.
There are various stories about it, but this is one of them. And so he was kind of he's sort of set up in practice, and he also worked for Mataró, doing some sort of furniture design for his big project, which was this like mega house and chapel for a guy called the Marquis of Comillas, I think, which is in the north of Spain. I think it's in Asturias. Or finally, he does also do a couple of commissions for the city. He designed a bunch of lampposts in Plaza Real, and I think also for the Ciutadella Park, which, although I guess these ones are probably a bit later. So
they are later. These ones were the two lampposts were a very early one, and they were an open competition.
I had the impression someone put a word in for him, but anyway.
They may have done, but it wasn't. It was also an open competition.
It's interesting. So this is
not that anyone has ever in the history of architecture done an open competition and then rigged it.
Yeah. It's. I mean, what would you say about this, which is kind of interesting? These are the ones in Plaza Real. It's ironwork.
It's cast iron.
Yeah, it's got like a very sort of strongly expressed base.
Fancy stone base, yeah. If I remember rightly, there's a coloured stone base. There are triangles with circles on them in cast iron. There's the kind of shaft, as Ruskin would say, of the lamppost going up, which is cast iron. It then has... They're like dragons' mouths or something. So the actual lamps themselves... are on the end of a stick that's coming out in the sort of shape of a kind of dragon with an open mouth, which are very elaborate. And then there's a top with a kind of decorative sculptural finial on top with swirly snakes and I can't remember what the sculpture on the top is. It was fairly brightly coloured.
Yeah.
It's got lots of it's cast iron, so you can do a very elaborate element. And you get a great get a lot of bang for your buck if you use it several times. So there's something like 4 pieces of cast iron, which are very elaborate. This kind of lamp with a dragon mouth, this base plate, which has got a kind of V and wreath thing, and the top, which are used several times, and then obviously there are 2 of these lampposts. But it's also like you go like, this is an extraordinary amount of work that's gone into a lamppost.
Yeah, it's very, very over-designed, but it's...
No, they obviously wanted it.
Yeah, and it's a sort of partially successful fusion of like an incredibly ambitious number of elements. But there's also there's an interesting story about
for a young designer.
Yeah. Oh no, I'm not saying it's bad.
It's like it's fairly prodigious.
The
amount of elements that are designed in it, and the fact that they're brought together at all, and it is using an understanding of how you can kind of achieve it. It's not like totally dumb. It's not like he's just drawn it and not thought from the beginning about how it would be made.
No, from the start, he knows how to get things done, and he knows. I mean, he comes from a family of makers.
Yeah.
And from the start, definitely one of his sort of advantages on everyone else is that he knows he knows how things are made, where to get them made, how to talk to people who make them, how to identify good people and work with them. There is a story about this, which is that even on this project, first ever project.
I like that we've read completely different books, which means that we have a totally different set of stories.
Absolutely, like bust the budget.
Yeah.
There was a fixed cost for how much they would be paid for it. And when he eventually invoiced for it, he invoiced for something like 15 times as much as was in the competition. And they eventually paid him 4 times what they'd been proposing to. But the result was he never got another commission from the city of Barcelona.
I was going to say, this is his first and last municipal project.
That was the only one. He never got another one. He instantly blew through the budget, got into a row and burnt his bridges. And blowing through the budget is something he would never do again, having learned his lesson. It's something which will happen on basically every other project as well. And then there's one other sort of... Oh, I mean, look, I just want to talk about these weird things. Like, what was this for? Isn't this for the Expo Park? Yeah, something like that. Anyway, they are... So you've got a big fence, a big full fence, and then you've got a gate, and on either side they've got gate posts, which are like 3 times as tall as the fence, which was already probably 2.5 meters tall. Yeah.
And what are they? It goes up. It's got this like very complicated middle bit, and then on the top, it's got this ridiculous, like
it's like a haunted suit of armor, basically.
Like sci-fi helmet thing on the top with lots of. It's very weird.
Yeah.
How was that getting commissioned? It's like it was a period when you could get some really weird stuff done.
Yeah, that's what I
Not
mean.
everything as weird as this.
Yeah.
But people were doing it.
Yes. People were into the bizarre.
Like, you think of, like, the Paris Metro ironwork.
Yeah.
Which you would think that's quite weird as well. Or the kind of nouveau stuff that was kind of starting to get done in Belgium. Or even in boring England.
Yeah.
If you look at some of those, like, lampposts down by the embankment or something, they're very much more elaborate than you would think. A kind of sober municipal official would
really warranted,
spend money on.
Yeah. Indeed.
But they're
very bizarre.
Actually more wacky than those other examples.
Well, from that to something extremely pared back, he did also do, this is the last kind of little getting started project, he did and these are all between kind of 1878 and 1883-ish, sort of the first 5 years of the career. I think again he was put onto this by Mataró. There's a workers' cooperative called the Mataró, I think, which had like various cooperatively owned businesses, and he designed a bunch of different things. The main thing which survives is this big shed, which has been kind of reconstructed, but which is got these. It's the first appearance of these like big catenary arches, which are big.
Well, he never actually uses a catenary. An actual catenary. He uses the parabolas or hyperbolas. Okay. But the idea is that it's kind of like a catenary.
We should describe what those are.
The difference between these two things is not very interesting.
Yeah. So in principle, a catenary is the inversion of a hanging chain. So it's an arch which, rather than having like a straight bit and a kind of radius at the top or whatever, or an ellipse or, some kind of other shape, is this kind of continuously changing parabola.
Yeah, and if you have an arch, which is where the weight of it is the same at any point in the arch, it's the one that follows the force line. So if the loading is like continuous across the arch, that's the shape you get.
Yeah. So it gives you these rather elegant and strange, very minimal trusses, where it intersects at the top with a more conventional kind of big farm type shed roof, but the arches kind of droop gradually down into the space of the room and kind of create these bays which are used for leaning ladders against and storing big piles of whatever that is inside.
I think this is a long time after it was, because this was a machine shop.
Yeah. And it's been restored now, and I imagine you can probably go and have a conference there or something. It's just on the biography. Also, something which happened when he was working on this is that he fell in love with one of the teachers at the school, who was a woman called Pepita, I think, and was rejected by her. She just wanted to marry someone else. It's like a thing in his life that like he's quite into renouncing things. He quite liked to like completely give up on things and renounce them altogether. And the love of women was one of those that he did.
Well, in this book, which is Antoni Gaudí, a reappraisal by the New York Graphical Society, which is quite well written, it was during this period that he was in his prime, 26 to 32 years old, that he fell in love with a young girl of 16. Though aware of the architect's feelings, decided in favour of a timber merchant.
This is it. Although she was working. She was a teacher. In the biography, she's described as a teacher. Also, her age is not given, so that may or may not be correct. But prima facie sounded like a slightly unlikely partner for him. She was like a Republican and like a radical, really. I mean, that they all were. I think he liked to. I'm not sure it can be right, because the woman that's described in the biography had already divorced her first husband.
Well, that would be impossible in this one.
Unlikely to do by the age of 16.
I don't know the sources of this one.
Yeah. That would be very Ruskinian, falling in love with a 16-year-old, though, wouldn't it?
He never married.
No. He had a couple of romances.
Dalliances.
So this was one, but I think probably for the best. I imagine that she made the right decision in deciding not to get married to him. I think we should say something about Barcelona before we go onto the kind of main projects as well.
He designed already, actually, though, at that point, several little things. And he's also, in all these early projects, designing little objects at the same time as designing buildings.
Yeah.
I mention that because I think we will have a general tendency to bypass, as architects do, a lot of the design work which is for small things.
Yeah. Bits
of furniture, objects. He designed a bee for the cooperative.
Yeah. It's a very nice little bee.
It's a lovely little bee.
Yeah.
And I'm going to want to try and slightly resist that because I think he spent quite a lot of his time designing bits of furniture and decorative things.
Yeah.
It's just something that we consider kind of frivolous now. But back to Barcelona.
Oh, it's very nice. He did a very nice shed for them as well. Yeah, so Barcelona...
Yeah, he did do, yeah.
So the comparison that struck me was with Vienna, actually, where Barcelona's development, a very sort of similar thing happened. The city had been increasingly overcrowded, and they'd been trying for some years to... they had to get permission from the central government, from the monarchy, to demolish the city walls. And this took a long time to secure, and then eventually, in the 50s, they were able to start work on doing this, on taking down the city walls and expanding the city. They held a competition, as you would, for the design of kind of larger Barcelona. And so, I mean, in our Otto Wagner episodes, we talked all about the way this project works out in Vienna, where they build a big ring around the city, and then they kind of build new districts expanding out from the medieval core on the other side of the ring. And the ring is this kind of site of like big monumental buildings and palaces and things.
But there is a bit of a difference, which is that in Vienna, there was already quite a lot of development outside the glacis. So in Vienna, there was a wall and there was a kind of military cleared zone.
Yeah.
And then there'd been quite a bit of development on the outside. So there was a periphery. And that meant that the ring was largely developed as a bourgeois development.
Yeah.
In Barcelona, there was not very much development outside the walls.
Yeah, there were sort of towns.
There was some big towns, and there was things starting, but they kept it quite close in. And that meant that when this huge plan, it was a plan that really encompassed everything. And bits within the new development would be working areas, lower middle class areas, and bourgeois areas.
Yeah. So it was, this very compact medieval core with its fortified
Barcelona,
wall.
a city with a long, storied history.
Yep. And in fact, the competition-winning design that they selected was, to my eyes, quite similar to Vienna. It has a ring where the walls used to be. That ring obviously terminates in the sea in two places because Barcelona's next to the sea, and then it has districts laid out kind of radially coming out of the big ring. And so, that was the one the city council selected, but they were overruled by the central government for some reason, who instead imposed the plan of a guy called Ildefonso Cerdà, which is one of the like iconic grid plans. It's a totally uniform grid, like with a couple of kind of diagonal roads through it, and otherwise there's like a basic block plan which is kind of the same size, which is replicated all the way across this whole kind of space of future urban development, and within which the existing city is this sort of it's this sort of mass kind of floating within the plan, but not centralized within it, and not kind of like the form and the layout of the grid don't particularly sort of celebrate or make kind of great gestures towards the pre-existing geography of the city. There are some slight ones. The position of the kind of diagonal and things is kind of calculated, but
well, the diagonal runs from the port
yeah
outward. to the kind of center of mass. And the old city, because there's a hill on one side, the old city is kind of in a corner of this new projected thing. And the other thing is the projected grid is massive.
Yeah.
So they kind of drew out the lots for an enormous expansion of the city that would not really... Barcelona would fill that out sometime in the 20th century, sometime after Gaudi died.
And this was brought in. So this was being done when Gaudi was born. This is in the 1850s. So
the grid is famously, it's squares with the corners chamfered off.
Yeah,
and a hollow centre originally.
It's slightly compressed on the north-south axis. They're slightly wider than they are high.
But they're almost squares.
So it's obviously very reminiscent of Manhattan, like this idea of laying out an incredible, like massive grid, which is like vastly more than future generations will need for a long time to come in the future. It also kind of had all sorts of theories. It was connected with all sorts of theories of like hygiene and the width of the streets was to allow kind of planting of trees and separation of different kinds of traffic and infrastructure for sewerage and all these kinds of things. So it's very, very kind of forward-looking from that point of view, and it's very technological. But it also just took like an incredibly long time to be built out to any reasonable degree. So you found this map. When is this from? This map of
the late 1890s.
There are
15% done, 20% done.
There are like blocks which are maybe like 3 or 4 rows away from the centre of the city, still maybe like 5 or 6 away, which are completely unbuilt.
Yeah,
this one, and lots of them just have one tiny thing in the corner.
And there's various like bits of public transport which kind of have things built along them. And there's sparse development a long way out, but there's big holes.
Yeah.
People got around to developing things at very different times. And the next picture, I think, is really like this is. There's lots of pictures like this. This is the famous Sagrada Familia, the Church of the Sacred Family, a little after Gaudi's death. It's in a land which is not quite a wasteland, but is like, what percentage developed is that? 10?
Yeah.
And there's lots of goats.
Yeah, and this is in the middle of the city. It's pretty incredible.
I mean, the area around there was a fairly poor suburb.
Yeah.
But still, it was a work in progress. The thing that I thought Barcelona was a bit like in this time, this isn't obviously an exact comparison at all, but if you want to think of something now, like a rapidly industrializing city in Ethiopia.
Mm.
You know, there's a long storied history.
Yeah.
There's rapid industrialization.
Yeah.
There's poor people coming in. There's quite a lot of threat of war.
Yeah.
Off in the hills. And the political situation is there's sort of a constitutional system, but there's also like lots of generals and aristocrats and powerful rich people.
Yeah.
And livestock in the city centre. Well, not quite in the city centre, but like in a lot of the places that people are being developed. Much more like that than you would think of, than the idea that you get from a European city now.
Yeah,
because we just are not in this phase of our development. And we have not been in this phase of our development for a long time. And it's hard to remember that the reason that in lots of European cities, all the buildings look sort of alike in large sections is because they were all built at the same time in a period of crash urbanizing.
Yeah, which is not yet.
Which is sort of...
It's going to start
happening.
Yeah. Up in the north of this grid, and at the time that it was built, really sort of surrounded by not very much at all and able to purchase quite a large sort of garden for itself. Gaudi was contracted to build a house for a tile merchant. So
tile manufacturer,
yeah. So he'd already at this point made a connection with Eusebio Güell, who was like a big kind of industrialist with kind of all sorts of industrial concerns huge range of businesses, and he is also
baking, corduroy,
concrete. So the guy was but this was another guy with a big industrial business whose name was Don Manuel Vicens Montaner, and so this was a project that he started in 1883, and it's a house for the family originally in these quite spacious grounds, and it has lots of things about it which are very novel, and it has lots of things which are also grounded in a kind of historical fantasy, and it's a very particular one. It is particularly the fantasy of the period of Muslim occupation in Spain, the kind of Moorish period, or the architecture is sometimes called mudéjar, which I think refers to like the continuation of the Moorish style after the departure of the rulers or something. I don't know. Totally clear.
There isn't, by the way, a really deep history of Moorish architecture in Barcelona. They were kicked out of Barcelona quite a long time before.
But they alight on it. So, like all across Europe, there is a question about in what style should we build. Everyone is asking it everywhere. We've talked about it lots and lots of times before. And we're living through the kind of Catalan Renaissance in this point. So Catalonia obviously kind of exists as a people and it exists as a language. During the 19th century, they've also done the kind of necessary thing of moving it from a language which people merely speak to one another to one in which it's possible to write epic poetry. So there's the celebrated great first epic written in Catalan, Atlantide, which is sort of about all sorts of things, including the city of Atlantis, as it sounds like. And then there's a sort of question of like, what should Catalan architecture be like? How should it express the soul of the nation, its storied history, its greatness? And people... And, how should it draw on the kind of correct European precedents and sort of reject the incorrect ones? And how should it distinguish itself? And the key kind of thing is like to take some of the right things from the right bits of the Gothic and the Romanesque, but the distinction from the rest of Spain, and certainly from the rest of Europe, which they decide to impose on themselves, is to kind of draw on this history of Moorish architecture, primarily actually from further south in Spain. The kind of iconic example of which obviously is the Alhambra.
Yeah. And that makes a lot of sense. You can see in this building a lot of obvious, both on the inside and the outside, Moorish references. But as you have taken up the position of like rationalizing Gaudi in my two like rationalizing and exoticizing, I'm going to say this is really weird.
It is really weird, yeah.
It doesn't look like a Moorish building at all. It's got this checkerboard green and white tiles on the outside printed, which makes it look like a kind of big gingham tablecloth.
It looks like
it's got
a Minecraft building.
It's like a Minecraft building. It's super blocky. All of the arches are kind of, everything is really like, we've got square tiles.
Yeah,
this
we've got this module which is like this big,
which is the size of a bathroom tile.
Can be
and everything is about Minecraft bathroom tiles.
Yeah.
At the bottom, it's not like that either. It's this rough brick, which is kind of rustic.
The bottom is stone, and then it's brick,
it's stone,
brick above.
Sorry.
Yeah, sorry, I can see. I've got some. Yeah,
I have been to this building, but ages ago. I have strong memories of it.
So the lower bits are these sort of coursed, flowery bathroom tiles with like rough stone rubble, and then the upper bits are...
Which feels like they really feel very 70s.
Yeah.
There's this strange property. Well, there's a twin strange property, one of which is that ceramics, glazed ceramics, don't age.
Yeah.
And unlike the brash wallpapers of the mid-19th century, which have now kind of gone due to their ephemeral quality, the brash prints of 19th century ceramics don't fade. And the other one of which, this whole thing was completely scrubbed clean and done up not very long ago.
Yeah.
Which makes some of this stuff feel very...
Yeah, I think certain amounts of this are recreated. I don't know how much of it is original. Certainly all those shutters are redone.
I think basically all the tiles at the bottom or most of them were redone.
Yeah, so it has this really strange... I mean, it has this very kind of compelling sort of silhouette. It has these kind of big tower at the corner, and it has, as it kind of goes up, the silhouette is broken up, and then the edge is kind of drawn out with all of these. It's kind of broken up horizontally. The line is sort of pushed in and out, and then there's also kind of corbelling everywhere, where things are kind of pulled out, and then they have like a special kind of little jagged corbel supporting it underneath, and it kind of creates, they had like these sort of miniature stalactites on the overhang.
For me, it's like a very blocky building is then, and it's not a super wild shape at first, but it's kind of dithered, or the edge is broken at 3 scales.
Yeah.
There's the scales of these sort of protruding towers out of the block, and then this colonnade of kind of tall, thin columns, which runs along as a colonnade at the second floor level.
Yeah.
Or first floor level, I'm pretty sure. And other details at that scale, windows and things. And then the surface is kind of dithered in and out with corbelled brick protrusions, which are all tiled.
Yeah.
So sometimes things are set out, of course, with a tiling, making stripe patterns, which are then graphically matched with these very strongly contrasting green and white tiles, some which are printed.
The sort of forms of the windows, for example, feel like kind of abstractions of what, it feels like a previously more elaborate form which has been kind of abstracted by the simplicity of the module. But then the overall form of the building is kind of over-elaborated again by...
it's like it's grown... it feels like a grotto-y thing which has been grown over, but then radically conformed...
To this grid.
Yeah. Except that it actually then has a lot of second-order things attached to it. It's got a lot of decorated shutters in very bold graphical patterns and ironwork. There's a... around the windows, we're seeing here that these shutters, which I think have all recreated. And there's a lot of like plain geometric work there. And actually, in the approach to it, there's this fantastic iron fence. Which is made of
big palm leaves.
Cast iron palm leaves, and then wrought iron details along the top, which you sort of see in the approach. There's a long wall of this. And you kind of see this detail foliage. And it's this strange play of blocky, grotto-y building where the details have become like sucked into this pixelated form. Which is also covered in naturalistic motifs. And then all of this metal nature, naturalistic iron foliage, and then like graphic printed foliage, and then on the inside it's all naturalistic. So all the foliage has become artificial. It's strange where this kind of grotto-y form has become pixelated. There's a complicated language of ornament going on.
I mean, that all kind of continues on the inside, doesn't it? The inside really continues this kind of weird mishmash of historical references. So, as I remember, the kind of the sort of the main kind of living room space on the ground floor with these 2 entrances going out onto a veranda, and at either end they're almost like sort of Dutch style landscape paintings or something, which are built into these.
Or was it like 4? Or I remember walls which have got lots of these.
Like views of the city and things like that, and they're but then built into all of this kind of wooden cabinetry. You've got more kind of internal corbelling, but strangely, like the reading of it is very different on the inside. The kind of corbelling motif on the outside feels like something from the Alhambra, whereas on the inside, it suddenly feels like much more Gothic. It feels like that kind of corbelling that you get, the kind of corbelling that you get under like a big roof beam when you have a sort of flat wooden roof in a cathedral or something like that. It's kind of... It's curious.
Well, for me, more like vernacular as well, like big vernacular halls or kind of the standard historical ceiling. Like it's not that dissimilar to something you could see as a detail that Palladio wouldn't have designed in a Palladio villa.
Yeah. Just the right way to do it. And then it's got two doors which lead out onto this veranda, which is very strange, largely, I think, recreated. I think it was all stripped out and glazed subsequent to construction, but which in the original idea has these wooden screens which screen you from the sun, which are almost like kind of like jali screens or something from Indian architecture. And then it had originally this bizarre kind of spider web sculpture, the idea of which is that water would sort of run down it and the sun would come through and cast like rainbow patterns.
Yeah, which is in like black wrought iron.
Yeah.
Fine filigree, oval.
Yeah.
I had a couple of things to say about this sort of ground bit.
Yeah.
Which apply to the whole interior really, which is that firstly, okay, this is very arts and craftsy. There's a huge amount of detail everywhere. It feels like the Ruskinian thing of like there's, I'm sure Gaudi's designed a lot, but a lot of the direct decoration on the interior feels like it's been given to a crafts workshop who have developed it in their own style.
Yeah.
Outside, there is this shockingly, for me, modern feeling, very stripped back geometrical decoration. The oval spider web, the grid patterns of these sunscreens, for me, felt very radically modern for this period, 1880s. And possibly pointing your interest in a kind of abstraction of Eastern architecture or something like that.
Yeah.
But were very shocking, but utterly not really in sympathy with the very elaborate, full of very elaborate, heavy 19th century furniture, heavy, like majolica detail glazed tiles on the interior, cut plaster, painted decoration of like lots and lots of foliage.
Yeah. All in sort of relief. And
in relief, but also in a graphical style that in no way matches with the kind of Gaudi graphical style.
No,
he was very capable of producing that drawing, but it doesn't feel at all synthesized. It feels like an early work.
Overstuffed.
Yeah, but not just overstuffed. Like, there are very different competing languages right next to each other.
Yeah.
It feels like it's a completely different... The language of the exterior and these graphical points feels like something that's approaching a kind of... not a modern of modernism, but a modern of the abstraction of the late 19th century. You know, where the classical forms or the Beaux-Arts forms are in some way stripped back in their complexity and kind of made stark and powerful.
Yeah.
As a kind of attempt to do that. Whereas the inside is full of rich, loose detail, like softness, dark corners, masses and masses of deep relief decoration.
Or even in the smoking room, which has this papier-mâché roof. It has this kind of egg box texture, which I think is taken from the Alhambra. No, this is
well, it's definitely an Arabic architecture style, isn't it? It's very difficult to describe. You'll have to kind of look at it, but that kind of corbelling where it comes to a point.
Yeah.
It's diagonally coming in at the roof, but it's sort of serrated.
Yeah, but it's I mean, this to me is getting towards like Horace Walpole or something. Is this kind of
well, the papier-mâché is very Horace Walpole.
Yeah.
That one is nearer to working for me because it's kind of geometrically graphical, but it doesn't have all these like painterly languages.
Yeah, it's still a strange fusion between that and the tiles below and the windows, and also the shapes of the rooms are quite strange.
I think partly because this is partly a property of Spanish as opposed to the northern types. The volume of colour and light is really turned up. In British buildings, you know, if you were thinking of like is it Temple Place?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's this level of like camp ornamentation, but it's like all brown wood and things.
Yeah.
You know, these big cod manorial halls of London, rich people.
Yeah, Astor is Temple Place. Yeah.
But, you know, there's the whole style, whereas this is super brightly coloured, like really high saturation, gaudy.
Yeah.
And every surface detail.
It's also got a very peculiar plan. The plan itself is not peculiar, but the method of circulation is peculiar. The plan is quite simple, kind of rectilinear. There's a sort of central staircase. There's a kind of big room in the middle, and things are sort of organised around it. But there is an idea about always moving in and out through the corners of rooms, which produces some quite strange effects. And they're more... they're a bit strange on the ground floor, and then they are more exaggerated on the first floor, where in between where you have kind of bedrooms and bathrooms, and in between the bedrooms and bathrooms are these strange sort of hexagonal miniature lobbies, where you'll have 3 different doors coming into a little lobby and then leading off into the different rooms. And it's if you're looking at the video, ignore the upper bit of this plan, which is the kind of subsequent refurbishment is not by Gaudi.
Yeah, it doesn't look like it at all.
Yeah, but these like little lobbies are very strange. Their decision about how to circulate between the rooms, I think, has a particular effect as well, because it tends to suppress the awareness of other rooms from the room that you're in. So that with the way that they're laid out, it's very you're not really aware of, and you don't tend to see from one room into another room. There's always... It's not like you have a view from one space into another space and the 2 spaces are kind of related visually, or, even like lots of architects in this period or shortly after are starting to kind of explore these more free forms of planning. If you think of, Frank Lloyd Wright, who we talked about, or Adolf Loos or whoever, spaces which are kind of defined but also kind of the same space. That sort of ambiguity. This is almost the exact opposite of that. It's like finding a way to, because even in very traditional forms of plan with sort of enfilade, you kind of see from one room into the next room into the next room. In this one, it's like the most suppressed form of circulation between the rooms that you could imagine. So the room is kind of like a little world of its own. It's quite strange and quite sort of subtle.
The effect of it's interesting. So things you can think about it being, in the enfilade, you actually have these really thick walls and you have set up double doors between it. So there's this kind of servant space in between. And it feels a bit like that. Or like a telephone kiosk is the other thing it feels like, which goes between. It also feels like, to me, unpracticed architecture.
Yeah, it doesn't really make sense.
I'm going to reinvent the wheel.
Yeah, it doesn't really make sense, no.
We could talk about the way in which it makes each of these isolated, insulated, super decorated rooms into its own sort of super space, like super intense space, a bit like Horace Walpole's weird rooms, where like each room is its own thing and the way between them is weird.
Yeah.
I personally think that's, I may be wrong, I personally think that's an unintended consequence of him trying to do something clever.
I think also it kind of works... It probably works for him as the architect he was at that period because, typically being young and less experienced, synthesis is one of the things which is sort of harder to do. And it does feel, as you've already said, like this is a building made up and lots of ideas in an additive way where they're not necessarily communicating with each other incredibly strongly. At
several levels. Like the level of he's got lots of ideas, and also he's, I think, working with a lot of... We talked earlier about how he's got a strength of being able to understand craft specialism.
Yeah.
And you can see his incredibly strong background in metalworking and that really well done metal fence, which is very...
Yeah.
It's like almost virtuosic or whatever for a young person.
Yeah.
But... he's also working with a whole load of things he doesn't really know about, and he doesn't manage to integrate them into the whole. The kind of decorative.
Yeah.
The decorative scheme doesn't successfully integrate with the building for me. It is cool.
Yeah.
And I think they would have put enough stuff in all these. They're all empty now, but they would be really full of stuff, which he was meant to design quite a lot of. I think there's only one piece that he designed.
Yeah, there is an internal photo which gives the impression of, it's got like these kind of sort of hanging, is that like a lamp or something.
Yeah, it feels like
I mean,
like a really pimped up version of those like glass mosaic hanging lamps that of sort of mock.
But it does also feel like a bit of an Oriental fantasy. It has a bit of like Leighton House, Lord Leighton's kind of which has a sort of internal courtyard that's meant to feel like something from Calcutta or something.
But it's also just massively full of like loads of Victorian consumer stuff.
Yeah.
Lots of decorated furniture.
Yeah. It's cool though. Definitely interesting. Upstairs,
this was like one of my favourite things. Actually, I really enjoyed visiting it. I've been a bit harsher on it. I think
it's nice that it's slightly off the beaten track. It's not quite on the like core Gaudi itinerary at the moment, which is very much to its benefit. Some of the ones we're going to talk about later, which are definitely suffer from that. And I think that there's something about the kind of Gaudi interpretation industry that I think might be worth trying to unpack a little bit. The way in which people want to understand him and think about him, I find quite strange. So yeah, I think we're going to talk about a couple of other little domestic projects.
Domestic projects for very big houses for super rich people.
So at the same time he was working on a project, this is again, I think this one's in Santander.
That's also I think it's also in the town in on the coast.
So this is another one, also in Comillas, for a different client.
He died just before it was finished.
Yeah.
He made money in Cuba. He came back and built a big house for himself.
And it's not totally clear.
It's called
El Capricho.
I mean, I think it has another name, but that's literally the Capricho.
The Capricho. Yeah.
The folly.
And it's very bizarre. I think it's partly. Well, yeah, it's very, very strange. This one really is like Disneyland architecture. This is the bit of Gaudi where I sort of have to get off for a bit and then come back later.
It's a building which is we talked about him designing that like very fanciful fountain.
Yeah.
He didn't go to the site. He just sent them a package of drawings.
Yeah.
I think he may have visited it at some point. And it looks like that. It looks like a fanciful set of drawings. I mean, he's done it in a way where it actually can be done.
Yeah.
But it's not very. It's definitely very playful and like the realization of a set of drawings.
Yeah, I mean, in the previous in Casa Vicens, we talked a little bit about the building kind of marshalling some different historical reference points. In this one, there is very much more of a sense of it as like as a kind of clear collage. So there is the house has a big tower over its entrance, the base of which is a sort of Romanesque, four kind of Romanesque stubby columns, on top of which is a kind of bright green ceramic glazed lighthouse. And on top of,
I think you're almost not doing the wacky like Disney fairy tale-ness of that. Like it's like green square diamond tiles with like red dots on them, with windows with red.
They look like fish scales, and and they have what are they? They're like sort of flamboyant Gothic windows, but red.
But in like like in crimson, thick gloopy glazed tiles.
And then the top of the lighthouse is like a sort of super corbelled top of a castle tower, a bit like the castle in Milan or something like that, but also green and red.
Or an exaggerated end of a cannon.
And then on top of that is something which looks like a kind of pavilion from on top of the Red Fort in Agra or something like that, but also green and red.
But it also looks like a big green and red rock suspended above the air.
Yeah.
Because it's on these super teeny weeny fine cast iron columns, and it really looks like a rock hanging in space in a kind of computer gamey or fantasy way. It's a real fantasy device.
It's extremely bizarre.
With a gold top, gilded top.
And then most of the house is, in this case, I think it is brick, but with coursing of ceramic tiles again, but this time they're like big cast ceramic sunflowers. I think I've got a picture of the detail of it. I think that they're I think it's brick mostly, but maybe with some stone as well. It's also got a very strange plan, which I don't know if it's related to the architecture of the area in some way. It has essentially like a kind of hemicycle of connected rooms, which are arranged around like a big greenhouse conservatory with a sort of ambulatory corridor. And I didn't know if this was related to, like, I know that in parts of northern Spain you have like these kind of like double glass walls and conservatories and things like that. So I guess it may be kind of coming out of an existing.
It looks like in the plan and stuff, in the plan and the drawings, it looks quite fun and cool.
I guess that's south facing as well, isn't it? Yeah, looks like it. So
I don't know. I would hope that on this plan, north is well, I would hope that greenhouse is north facing. If that greenhouse is south facing in Spain, it's gonna incinerate everyone.
But it's I mean, the north is quite cold and rainy, and very windy. I think.
Yeah.
Close to the ocean. Yeah,
well, the ocean's at the bottom, so it must be rotated around.
Yeah. Okay, so that's north facing. Yeah. Well, that makes sense.
That would make sense.
Yeah.
The conservatory's on the north side, which is the side that conservatories belong on.
Yeah.
It looks quite lovely. I can imagine this is like you would put all your like tropical plants in this beautiful glass-filled white atrium-y greenhouse and have the bubbling water and maybe some little tweeting birds, and then have this like thick Gothic fairy tale palace around it.
Yeah.
I think it suffers from the fact that he wasn't there at all. He just sent them a load of drawings.
He didn't like to leave Barcelona or Catalonia. He did when he was young.
Well, his mates were there. So,
when he was young, he went on a holiday to Toulouse, and then after he'd done it, he said he was never going to go abroad ever again, and that was it. Yeah, I think he didn't really like to travel.
Yeah, he did spend some time. Spent a couple of years in Lyon. No, I mean not Lyon.
Laon. No.
Leon.
Well, we'll get when we talk about those buildings. I will do the research for how they were built.
I think he spent some time at those ones, but I don't think he spent very much time at this one. No. And we were talking about the Ruskinian technique, and I think the Ruskinian thing of like working with lots of craftsmen and stuff is that you're there and you're helping them, and they're doing their thing, and you're kind of like directing an orchestra. He also is someone who, like kind of Carlos Scarpa, is continually developing the project as he's there on site.
Yeah,
and he didn't do any of that for this. He just designed, using his Beaux-Arts like drawing visualization skills, a project out, which is quite impressive, having barely been there. Like the plan and stuff look quite cool and fun, but the decoration looks a bit dumb.
Looks horrible.
I'm not sure I'd go all the way to
I can't get on with this stuff at all.
But
no.
But
I can't get on with this. I'm against this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I haven't been. I'm not sure I'm as against it as you are. I think I've got some space in my heart for this, but it's very much a minor work.
You know what does it is all the little sunflowers on everything.
Oh, I quite like that.
No. I can't go along with that. There's a little sculpture of the architect.
The maestro. It looks like it's been rubbed by lots of people because it's a bronze one that's got that.
I think also the building was mucked around with for large parts of its history, and I think parts like, for example, the conservatory is completely reconstructed. And the problem is that the availability of extremely good craftspeople is not quite what it was in the last 20 years of the
at this really good
century.
Point when you could do loads of stuff, when you've got industrial power and money, and you've still got kind of like a legacy of craft production, where there's lots of people who are still, and they're relatively cheap compared to the wealth.
Yeah.
So you can
do insane levels of detail.
And like all over the developed world at the time, like there were these super elaborate, fin de siècle styles. And that period has stopped, and in fact stopped quite a long time ago. He was at the end of craft production as a mainstream activity. When he was born, away, a lot of stuff was still made in a non-industrial way because no one had really built the factories yet.
Yeah.
And they were making a lot of money building the factories while he was alive, and then at the end they built them, and you no longer needed someone to make coppers for like making the hot water to clean your clothes in by hand because a machine would do it.
Yeah.
Or at least some people in a factory with powered tools would do it.
And then a final one from the same time. He did his first project for the. Yeah, this is like his first major project for the Güell family.
Yeah.
Is a set of gatehouses. They call them the Güell Pavilions, but they were like the gatehouses for the family estate, right? They're now very much in
the gatehouses for the gardens of this sprawling estate in the countryside, which was nevertheless in the grid.
Yeah.
But very much in the road next to it was a track, and they kind of existed as like pavilions inside a landscape garden. And they're not just the gatehouses because it's kind of a complex, and I'm also not sure if some of it hasn't been destroyed. But the photographs of them being used at the time, they feel very much like they are pavilions in a garden.
Yeah.
That are kind of grotto-like. On one side, they are facing the road now and are quite external and wally.
Yeah, they feel like the corner of the
they feel like the corner
block.
of a block. But on the inside, they've got... It's kind of nicer than what we were talking about before, but they, again, have got tiles.
Yeah.
Which, again, are deeply textured. But this time not glazed, mostly, although some of them are.
Yeah, these ones, I think that the Güell Pavilions are much nicer for not going so colourful, I think.
I haven't visited these, so I'm not...
No.
I don't have first-hand experience of them. And the photographs of them at the time are all black and white, obviously.
Yeah.
But again, they've got this abstract sculptural form starting to crop up on the roof. There's things that feel like they're going to go towards the chimneys of the Güell Palace, which I'm sure we'll be talking about in the next episode.
Yeah.
There's, like, perhaps with the posts on the side of the park gates, there's strange decorative towers.
Yeah.
There's this post which just goes up, and it's got, on one side of the gate, it's brick, goes up. It's got a big stone decorative motif. It goes up with more brick. And on the top, it's got a very elaborate stone finial, which is very large, tall, which feels vegetal, like the top of some big flower. What's that one that goes up? And it's got a huge kind of central stoma.
Yeah.
But very elaborated. And then on top of that, there's a metal, which is actually antimony orange tree with the oranges coming out, which is a real flight of fancy. And then the gates that's a gate post of are themselves extremely fanciful. Well, it's one gate, isn't it? And it has this huge metal dragon with its gaping maw pointing towards you, which is a strange mixture of a kind of naturalistic, if you can do that, historically accurate dragon.
Scientific,
the scientific dragon at the mouth. And then the body of it is made of this kind of like, I don't know if it's expanded metal, but I think it's actually like some industrially produced mesh that's being hammered into a kind of billowing shape, like some over elaborate Baroque wind instrument, which feels very exotic.
Yeah, I wonder, do you think he's being kind of challenged to use these materials by the client?
If I was going to guess, I would say no. I would say the client is probably behind it, in favour of this, but his earliest projects have all involved metalwork, which is his background, which he has a facility with.
I mean, more like the strange, because some of these are almost like as found. They feel like kind of challenges, like make a sculpture with antimony or make a sculpture with this expanded metal. Or
I think that's the Viollet-le-Duc Ruskin, like you work with the new tools available, and I think he was deeply interested in it. And I don't believe all his clients would have, right at the end of his career, I don't think for the Güell crypt, Güell went to him and goes, I've got all of these broken giant machine needles.
Yeah.
Can you use them? That seems like using this seems very much in that sensibility to me.
I think with this one, I wonder about how you would get put onto this as a material.
Well, because he's been working on these other projects, and he's been working with industrial metal workshops to get these things fabricated, and the factories are there, and they will have made this stuff.
Yeah.
And I think he would have been very excited by this material, this strange material.
Yeah.
And wondered about its decorative potential. That would be my guess.
Yeah.
Partly because I see, whenever he sees a sort of substance, he wants to include that substance, and we're beginning to get this plays of materiality.
Yeah, yeah. There's a lot of...
It becomes more mature as we go on, and it's most mature with metalwork at the beginning, because it's something that he's grown up with, I think.
Yeah. I mean, the form of the buildings themselves is... They do feel much more protective, and I guess the Casa Vicens has sort of slightly fortified wall against the street, or a slightly kind of impervious feeling wall. But these ones, they're much flatter, they have much less fenestration, and the way that he uses the elevation is much more sort of playing with kind of horizontal and vertical kind of divisions and things. But you have these kind of much flatter, less kind of formally expressed planes, and then you have the sense of these things kind of hidden behind them. So there's I think that they conjure a bit of a sense of like the romance of the garden that's beyond the gate. You see these little finials and lanterns and things kind of hovering behind them.
Yeah, and they're making a wall, and they're making an entrance, but it's also one that is very landscapey in that it's very, very asymmetric.
Yeah.
Elements of it kind of rhyme. Like there's high things on either side of the gate, but they're quite different in character.
Yeah.
There are buildings on either side of the gate, but one of them is almost not a building. It's almost like a wall, and one of them is very much like a box. That kind of leads on to a domed pavilion, which feels like it's got an axis, but is actually kind of running along the wall rather than an axis that's going in.
Yeah.
That seems to be about creating an interesting complexity of three-dimensional mass. Also an inside and outside. And we will see through his career, when he can, these very complex kind of routes, like buildings that change in a very complex way in their massing or silhouette as you go around them.
I guess it also makes it feel it's a little bit like a little village or something. It has that quality that lots of arts and crafts buildings do, of adopting the massing of something accretive or something which looks like it's been built up over time. Which this
at the same time having a really strong unity of language in its materials.
Yeah.
Which I suppose you could say of a vernacular.
Yeah.
Like, oh, this village, everything's made of whatever.
Here's the interior.
It's white rendered, and it's got parabolic arches, sort of.
It's got a press conference going on inside it. It's but yeah, it's
This is a real bathos picture.
It's good. This is the end of the episode. Yeah, but it has, again, we've got parabolic arches. It's kind of nice. Parabolic arches, and those windows that Matthew has taught me to call lunettes, which are little semicircles up in the rafters.
I think he's introducing pernicious, correct architectural language. Yeah. I think we should resist it.
I don't know. We could just control the pace of adoption, I think, is enough. I mean, one of the challenges with Gaudi is that I think that it's difficult to know where the natural breakpoints are. When people sort of classify his career, broadly, there has been an attempt to identify a sort of stylistic evolution and to have epochs. Yeah. So there is a kind of, classically, there's an Orientalist epoch.
Which is what this would be.
Which is what this would be. And there's a Gothic epoch, which is yet to come. And there's a kind of naturalistic epoch, which is the kind of closing bit of the career. But
or another one.
Another one. I mean, or you can have more. But it's kind of muddied by the fact that the types of commissions are also different. So that later on, in the period after this, he's going to do a bunch of different types of buildings. He's going to do big institutional buildings. He's going to do more work, more non-domestic commissions. He's going to do some ecclesiastical commissions for the first time. part of the reason why these are all sort of the same style is because they're all sort of the same type of commission as well, aren't they?
Yeah.
They're like more or less, they're on the border between like a house and like a fun house. They're all for super rich people, and they're all kind of in these sort of slightly sort of peripheral conditions where you kind of have to create everything that's going to be
I mean, this is a bunch of follies, is what we've dealt with. Follies and like bits of decoration.
And yeah, I mean, it's not clear for the later types of buildings. It's not clear that you could build them in this kind of style, so-called, anyway, because they're a completely different type of building. So it's Anyway, we're not really working with that kind of frame because it doesn't totally make sense to us.
So initially, I was really, when we were first talking about the first ways of laying out a series of episodes on him, I was very much like, I want to cut across this. Partly because I have a chip on my shoulder and I'm like, oh, something's written in Wikipedia, it must be rubbish.
Yeah.
Lots of people have produced carefully crafted, learned responses, and this is what they've come up with. But also, it just doesn't ring true. My impression is that he had a very fluid mind and could bring out a whole set of responses. And if you look at the chronology, he's building buildings from these periods overlap in time enormously. And the periods also feature things that will carry through. The one bit that I haven't really been able to jam in is the Gothic work, which is kind of quite particular, or the historicist, the sort of more plain stone historicist. Well, we'll get onto it. I haven't really been able to
We'll get onto it. Luckily,
this.
we don't have to. We don't have to.
He's not someone who has like periods where his philosophy changes, but the world around him is also changing.
So around the time that all of these were being completed is the Barcelona Expo, which was in 1888. So all of these, I think, had more or less been built by then. They'd all sort of been commissioned around 1883, 1884. And that project would provide like a big moment of sort of crystallization of what Catalan architecture is about. The sort of ideology of the kind of Catalan style is what like for that moment what Barcelona is as a city. It's also kind of they also create lots of new sort of monuments and kind of urban structures and things,
including the museum that's got all the Romanesque churches in it.
Yeah, and it's that, I guess, can be a kind of jumping off point for the next episode. And I think it is definitely a point of inflection in his career, possibly away from that, actually, towards different and new sorts of things.
He's a man, I get the sense, who is very into his work.
Yeah.
His work drives his life. He cannot really compromise with it. He cannot really bend to someone's wishes. He had an enormous benefit of very generous patrons, who allowed him to spend a lot of money producing his art, in essence, without a lot of interference.
Yeah.
And that was when he was at his best. I think for him, the idea of following a style because it was fashionable or something like that didn't work on its own. He was very happy to take a style, say he's very happy to take the Gothic and see what he can do with it. But he's not really happy to take the Barcelona style and see what he can do with that.
He was not terribly clubbable, I think, and less so as time went on.
People do get stuck in their ways a little bit.
Yeah, definitely.
Have you noticed yourself becoming inflexible?
Yeah, absolutely.
Not just physically.
Yeah, well, mostly physically.
Do your dislikes now outnumber your likes?
No, I don't think so.
No.
I think I'm mellowing into blissed out old fella. Well, we'll see. Ask me in 2024.
It's been an interesting few years.
Yeah.
Thank you very much to those of you who've been following us all
Thanks.
this
Well
time.
done. Well done for listening to the end.
Bring on the next 100 episodes.
Yeah.
You got any thoughts after doing 100?
It's been enjoyable.
Yeah, it has.
Yeah.
Read a lot of books.
Yeah, I've read a lot of books. It's been very interesting. Yeah, I'm glad we did it.
Yeah, it's been great.
Yes.
It's been a real, like every other element in my life has changed quite a lot.
Yeah.
I've no doubt they will continue to change, but it's changed quite a lot in this time. But this has remained constant, although slightly changing in nature. Right at the beginning, we had quite a lot of time to do it in, and then quite quickly we didn't.
Yeah.
Well, it's been nice doing it with you.
It's been good.
Thanks,
yeah.
Luke.
You're welcome. Thanks to you as well.
And thanks to all of you.
Thanks to
and
all
with
of
that,
you. Yes.
good night.
Good night.